take the rest of the time we have today to introduce the digestive system. Really, I want to deal with the anatomy of things. Now, a lot of what's important about covering the digestive system is about its function, so this will be good. Today I'll go through the structures, and next week when we talk about it, we can get right into the function stuff. In talking about the components of the system, there's basically two groups of organs. The digestive tract, which is also called the alimentary canal. Actually, let me do it this way. Or the gastrointestinal tract, GI tract. This is made up of organs or structures that food passes through. It starts with the oral cavity, which is not an organ, which is why I put organ/structures. But it contains organs like the tongue and the teeth and those sorts of things that play a role. And then the food passes into the pharynx, which we were just talking about earlier today. And it only goes into the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx. The nasopharynx is superior to the oral cavity, and food should not go that direction. Okay. Doesn't mean that it can't go that direction, but it shouldn't go that direction. And then the pharynx passes food onto the esophagus, and then the esophagus connects to the stomach. And actually, if you're writing this down, I want to leave a space between esophagus and stomach. And then the stomach is made up of several different regions. Where the esophagus connects to it, it's called the cardia. Then there's the body of the stomach and the pylorus. I guess that is, I left out. Sorry. Next to the cardia is also a region called the fundus. Just a word about the fundus real quick. The word fundus is a general term that means a part of an organ that bulges up or arches up over something else or beyond something else. So the fundus of the stomach is just the part of the stomach that is arching up above where the esophagus attaches to it. There's a fundus of the uterus, which is the part of the uterus that arches up above where the fallopian tubes attaches to it. Or there's a fundus of the eye, which is where the cornea bulges out from the normal spherical structure of the eye. So fundus is just a general term for that kind of shape, but part of the stomach is shaped that way, so it's called the fundus. And then the stomach connects to the small intestine, which has 3 regions. It starts with the duodenum, which is probably more accurately pronounced duodenum, but everybody says duodenum. And then there's the jejunum and the ileum. Just 3 different regions. When I'm talking about function tomorrow, I'll show you this structure of the small intestine a little bit more directly. And then, of course, the small intestine connects to the large intestine, which is separated into different regions. where the ileum connects to it is called the cecum. And then it ascends, projects, whatever, superiorly as the ascending colon. Colon is essentially interchangeable with large intestine, although it's probably not perfect, but in this course, colon and large intestine are interchangeable terms. And then from where the side where the liver is, the colon transverses as the transverse colon to the other side, which then descends from where the spleen is down. And then it makes a S-shaped curve as the sigmoid colon. And I say S-shaped because sigma from the Greek is the letter S, which ends at the rectum, and that opens to the outside world as the anus. Okay. So those are different parts of the large intestine. I guess I've never actually typed this all out on the screen like this, so it takes up a lot more space than I thought. Now I left a blank between the esophagus and the stomach, not because there's something to add in there, but I want to make a point that at that level there is a barrier. What do we call the structure that's between the esophagus and the stomach? Now they're connected, but the esophagus is largely on one side of this structure, and there's a little hole for it to pass through to connect to the stomach. Anybody know what we find there? Actually mentioned it a couple of times earlier today in terms of the other system we talked about. Diaphragm, exactly. Now the diaphragm is not part of the digestive tract. It's just the barrier between the two. I want to point this out because the diaphragm, I think, is the best border between the upper and lower digestive tracts. If you look up upper and lower digestive tract on the internet, you're going to find the more classical definition for it, which is based on embryology. From the embryo, certain organs develop out of one part of the embryo and other parts develop out of something else. And so based on that, classically, the upper and lower digestive tracts are divided at a particular point, which I think is a bad idea. The reason I like the diaphragm is, one, it's very anatomical, it's based on the adult structures, and there's a very clear reason for this. The diaphragm is the border, the wall between the thoracic and the abdominal cavity. So the lower digestive tract is everything in the abdominal cavity. Okay. Also, there's a very abrupt change in the mucosal lining of the digestive tract at that point. If you had me for A&P 1, you probably don't remember this, but on the first practical, the case was about cystic fibrosis, and one of the symptoms that that patient had was GERD, or gastroesophageal reflux. So I had a microscope slide showing the border between the stomach and the esophagus, which is not a slide that we looked at, but it showed you the stratified squamous epithelium, which we would expect for the esophagus and the rest of the upper GI tract, just like I was saying earlier today, for the oral cavity, the oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. It needs that more protective digestive epithelium. That continues down through the esophagus. But then when you get to the stomach, it switches very abruptly to a simple columnar epithelium. And that's what you have continuing on through the intestines, both small and large intestines. So besides the cavities where we find things, also the stomach, small intestine, and large intestine have the same type of epithelium lining them, which is different from everything in the upper tract. Okay. So those are the digestive tract organs. The other set of organs we call accessory digestive organs, which help with the function of the digestive tract. Usually, those will just be listed as the salivary glands, which there are 3 of: the parotid gland, the sublingual glands, and the submandibular gland. Now, I'm making these singular. There's, of course, one on the right and one on the left of each of them. But salivary glands, which obviously secrete saliva into the oral cavity. And then there's the pancreas, which secretes digestive enzymes into the small intestine, as well as bicarbonate to help neutralize stomach acid. And then there's the liver / gallbladder. I can make that a little bit bigger. The liver is responsible for making a very important digestive juice called bile. The gallbladder stores bile. So I like to put them together because the gallbladder by itself isn't a whole lot. It doesn't make anything. It just stores it in between meals. Gall actually is another word for bile. Not that it's used that way in modern usage, but so the gallbladder stores bile. That's all it does. And it's found on the inferior surface of the liver. If you've ever looked at the liver model, the gallbladder is usually this little green pear-shaped thing attached to that. And in fact, if you look at one of these models here, there's this little green thing poking out. This is the gallbladder here. And all it does is it stores bile between meals as the liver is constantly making it. There could be a case to be made that other things could be included with the accessory digestive organs if you expand the definition of accessory organ. But these are all things that secrete digestive juices into the digestive tract. Other organs might help digestion in other ways, so we could include them there, but these are the main ones that you hear. So those are, the digestive organs. Okay, I'm making the text very small so that we can fit it all on the screen. But again, there's the digestive tract, which is what the food moves through, and the accessory organs, which the food doesn't go through any of those, but they make digestive juices to help with all of this. The digestive tract also makes digestive juices. There's digestive mucus, which is not the same as respiratory mucus. It's much more watery. And in certain places, it's an important part of what the organs do. We'll talk about some of those things next time, but this is the list of the structures. Now, if you look at the picture here, all of these are labeled. You can follow them through. Like I said, especially with the small intestine, the different parts I pointed out, when we're talking about the functional stuff next time, I'll show you pictures from the book that highlight where they are a little bit better. The other thing to consider when you're talking about the anatomy of the system is the tissues that make up the layers of a digestive organ. Now, this is, as is always the case in this material in the book, a representation of part of the small intestine. And the small intestine is the best place to kind of see these structures. The large intestine is a little bit quirky in the way that it's laid out, although it's kind of the same structures here. And the stomach, esophagus on the back have some variations from this that are unique to each of those organs. But using the small intestine, which is probably the majority of the length of the digestive tract, we can lay out these different layers pretty well. There are 4 layers that in this picture are represented by the bold-faced terms. Moving from the inside out, the layer that's directly adjacent to where the food moves through is called the mucosa. The mucosa is made up of an epithelium lining the lumen of the digestive tract, and then connective tissue surrounding that, which is, for any mucosa membrane, is called a lamina propria. That's just what you call the connective tissue next to a mucus epithelium. And then for this, there's a very thin layer of smooth muscle tissue surrounding it called the Muscularis mucosae. So in this picture, they've kind of extended just the mucosa out to see where that the components of that. Within the lamina propria, there can be some glands, small glands that are going to be secreting mucus. There will be mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, like we talked about with the lymphatic system, visible. But there also will be ducts passing through the mucosa that are coming from deeper glands. This gland here is on the other side of the Muscularis mucosae, which means that it's in the next layer in. Or this duct here passes through the Muscularis mucosae and keeps going and is going to connect to most likely an accessory organ somewhere outside of the tract. Okay. The next layer that's represented in the picture is the submucosa. Now, the mucosa is broken down in different parts that are important. The submucosa, we don't see any bullet list of the pieces to it because all it is connective tissue, just more connective tissue. It's just connective tissue on the other side of the Muscularis mucosa. It's going to contain quite a bit of nervous tissue. Part of the enteric nervous system passes through there. What we call the, where is it labeled here? The submucosal plexus. Plexus is just a, you done? Plexus just kind of means network. So we're talking about nerves or blood vessels for that matter. Sometimes we call them a plexus. So there's a plexus or a network of nervous tissue in the submucosa called the submucosal plexus. The next layer is called the muscularis, which is a thick layer of smooth muscle. For most of the organs, there are 2 layers of smooth muscle there. There's the circular muscle and the longitudinal muscle. That just describes their position in relation to the organ itself. So the circular muscle goes around the organ. When it contracts, it'll pinch in on the tube. The longitudinal muscle goes the length of the organ. And so when it contracts, it can kind of bunch the tube up a little bit, shorten the tube a little bit. For the stomach, and only the stomach, there's a 3rd layer of muscular tissue called the oblique layer. Oblique means at an angle. So it's a layer of fibers that's sort of at 45 degrees to either of the other 2 layers. And when we talk about the function of the stomach next time, I'll explain why it has an extra layer there. But all of the intestines, large and small, and the esophagus just have what we see here. When we get up into the pharynx and the oral cavity, the muscularis doesn't make a whole lot of sense because there's specific pharyngeal muscles in the wall of the pharynx, and there are specific muscles in the wall of the oral cavity, like your cheek muscles and your lip muscles and that sort of thing. So it kind of breaks down at that point. But for the esophagus, stomach, and intestines, there's a specific muscle layer there. Some sources might refer to it as something like the muscularis externa or something to differentiate it from muscularis mucosae. But if you hear just muscularis by itself, it's referring to the muscle layer, which is more common these days. There is another plexus of nervous tissue that's kind of surrounding the outside of the muscularis and worked into it a little bit, called the Myenteric Plexus. So my in myenteric is from the Greek root for muscle, myo, and then enteric is from the Greek word that basically means guts. So the gut muscle plexus is kind of what that means. And those are largely the nervous, that's largely the nervous tissue that controls the contraction of those smooth muscles. And then the fourth layer is called the serosa. It's a serous membrane. It's a third serous membrane that we've learned about in this course. The first one was the pericardium around the heart. The second one, which I just introduced today, is the pleura around the lungs. And then this one, the serosa, is the outermost layer of the digestive tract. Now, really the serosa, which is a simple squamous epithelium and its associated areolar connective tissue, just like we saw in other places, is only found in the abdominal cavity. Serosa is referring to it as a layer of tissue. It's a serous membrane, but it also has its own name. Same way the serous membrane in the lungs is called the pleura, and the serous membrane in the heart is called the pericardium. This is called the peritoneum. Have you ever heard of peritoneal or anything like that? It's referring to this. It covers the outside of the stomach and intestines, and actually it covers the outside of the liver and the pancreas and stuff like that too, and then lines the inside of the abdominal cavity. One difference, however, between the peritoneum and the pericardium or pleura is that there's actually a good bit of space between the organ and the wall, cavity wall. That extension from the organ to the cavity wall is represented in this picture up here. You can see the serous membrane, and it kind of extends away from the organ, which is kind of fading off in the picture, but the point is that it's going to the cavity wall. Or from the cavity wall, it extends in this way. So there's two layers of the serous membrane that make up a connection from the organ to the body wall. That's called the mesentery. And it has within it the blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerve fibers that are going out to get connected to that organ. The two torso models that we have over there, for the intestines are all one piece. I've grabbed a piece off of the digestive model that's on the wall that most of you can't see, which is really just the digestive organs from this torso model by themselves. And so you can see this thing is the transverse colon, like we'd see here. It's just on that model you can separate it. This is the mesentery of the transverse colon. So the serous membrane wraps around the organ itself, and then it extends back. And in the case of the transverse colon, it reaches back and attaches to the posterior body wall at that same level, which helps to keep the transverse colon in place. If it weren't there, then the transverse colon would just fall down to the bottom. So it keeps the colon up in place. And it does that for other structures too. It holds the stomach in place, it holds the liver in place, it holds the small intestines in place, etc., etc. That's what the mesentery is. Anchors everything in place, and it protects the blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerve fibers that are connected to the organ. Now, I don't think there's, it doesn't look like there's any lymphatic organs represented in this picture. They'd be green if they were, but they're not. So we just see red for artery, blue for vein, and yellow for nerve. But there'd also be lymphatic vessels in there too. outside of the abdominal cavity, the serosa doesn't really apply. The esophagus, instead of having the serosa, has connective tissue holding it in place, which is technically called an adventitia. Not that I'm ever going to ask you about that. But it's essentially the same thing as the outer layer of a blood vessel. And blood vessels have, as their tunica externa, just loose connective tissue that anchors them in place. The esophagus is essentially the same thing. And then when we get to the pharynx and the oral cavity, just like with the muscularis, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to describe this layer because for the pharynx, it's just incorporated into tissues around it. And then for the oral cavity, you want to think about what's beyond the muscular wall of the cheeks, for instance. Of course, that's your skin. So when we get up to those first parts of the digestive tract, the muscularis and the serosa don't really apply, but the other things do. A word about the nervous tissue here. This is the enteric nervous system, which is a term just referring to its peripheral structure in the gut. Again, enteric basically means guts. But also keep in mind that this is autonomic in function. So there are neurons there, which represent autonomic ganglia to some degree, and there are nerve fibers there, axons. The neurons that are there, that I just said represent autonomic ganglia, would have to be what type of autonomic ganglia? What type of autonomic ganglia would be in the wall of an organ?
I mean, sorry, that's not sympathetic.
You said sympathetic. You tried to say sympathetic to begin with. We'll just go with that, which would be wrong, and therefore it would have to be parasympathetic. Remember, sympathetic ganglia are the ones that are next to the spinal column, the chain or prevertebral ganglia. The parasympathetic ganglia are the terminal ganglia, which are in the walls of or very close to the target organs. And in fact, these are there. Okay. Now, the fibers, the nerve fibers that are coming in through the mesentery and synapsing on neurons in those ganglia. So we're talking about the input to those ganglia. What do we call those fibers in terms of the autonomic system? If they're synapsing on the ganglia. If they're synapsing on terminal ganglia, they have to be part of which division of the system? Which division of the autonomic system? If they're synapsing on terminal ganglia, they have to be parasympathetic. If they're synapsing on the ganglia, they are what ganglionic fibers? Oh, these. If they're connecting to the ganglion, if they're before the ganglion, they'd have to be pre-ganglionic fibers. Where do we find most of the pre-ganglionic parasympathetic fibers? What do we call the nerve that we find? Where's the radial nerve?
No, cranial.
Cranial. It is a cranial nerve. Which specific cranial nerve would be connecting to the enteric nerve? Sorry?
Vagus.
Vagus nerve, right. Now, the cutoff, there are some cranial nerves that go to the eye and salivary glands and that sort of thing. But everything that's out of the head and neck, it's getting cranial nerve input, is coming from the vagus nerve. That goes to the upper intestine, which is not a very anatomical term. But somewhere in the intestines, it switches from the vagus nerve to a sacral nerve. But, that's basically it. What do we call the axons that go from the myenteric plexus to the smooth muscle or the submucosal plexus to their targets? What are those fibers called? They are, in fact, postganglionic fibers. Can you be more specific? The ones that were synapsing on these plexuses were the preganglionic parasympathetic fibers. The ones that are going from, that are the fibers from the plexus to the targets would be the postganglionic parasympathetic. Now, what is the only component of the sympathetic side of things that would be seen in this picture? I thought those other questions were. And actually, it shouldn't be tough. We've worked through this. Do we see any sympathetic ganglia here? No. So it can't be preganglionic fibers because we don't even see the ganglia. So any fibers coming in here have to be what? They're not preganglionic, they are postganglionic. The the sympathetic ganglia that are influencing digestive organs are going to be chain ganglia or prevertebral ganglia, mostly prevertebral. And so the fibers, the axons leaving those ganglia going to the target organ are going to be the postganglionic sympathetic fibers, which is not a large component of what's going on here, but there is some sympathetic control over things. What's the main thing that the sympathetic system does to the digestive system? Sorry? You don't really relax muscles. You just contract muscles. So which muscles does the sympathetic side contract? That's not a good answer. There are some muscles in the intestines, but it's not specific to an organ. It's a type of muscle that we find throughout the digestive tract that's under sympathetic control. And I'm very surprised because there was it's all smooth muscle. Okay, you're being chased by a lion, okay? You're in fight or flight mode. The digestive system shut down. Okay? So you don't want to make most things contract, but there is one specific type of thing that you do want to make contract. And if you are being chased by a lion, you don't want to leave a scent trail. So what do you want to close off? Talking about the digestive system here. Again, it's not about a particular organ. It's all throughout the whole system. What types of muscles will keep scents from getting out of your digestive tract to let the lion know where you are? Sphincter muscles, right. Okay. Sphincter muscles contract under sympathetic control. Everything else contracts under parasympathetic control. Okay. You don't want food to move through your digestive tract when you're in fight or flight mode. There's no point because there's no blood to pick up nutrients. And why should you make it easier for the lion and pre-digest part of the food that you have in your system for him to eat? Okay. That's a joke. But, yeah, so sphincters are under sympathetic control. Everything else is under parasympathetic control, which by everything else really means most of what's going on here. So most of what we're looking at here would really represent parasympathetic components, but there's going to be the occasional sympathetic fiber in here. Now, really for this little stretch that we're looking at, since there's not a sphincter muscle right here, I wouldn't expect to see any sympathetic fibers, but there's a sphincter between the esophagus and the stomach. There's a sphincter between the stomach and the small intestine. There's a sphincter between the intestine, small intestine, large intestine. There's a sphincter at the opening of the large intestine, the anus. All of those sphincters will contract under sympathetic control. Okay. So that's the major rundown of anatomy here. Both the structures that make up the wall of one of these organs and just in general the organs in the system overall. Here's a picture, I've already talked about it, but this sort of represents where the peritoneal lining in the abdominal cavity is. That's the end of that. Then the chapter goes on to look at processes and regulation, just an overview of functions of the system, which I'll talk about a little bit to start off next time. And then it just basically goes through how the different components work. So basically the upper digestive tract, and then the stomach, and then the intestines. And then here it gets off to talk about the accessory organs, concentrating on the liver, gallbladder, and the pancreas. And then I'll actually talk about this. Actually, I'm going to talk about this now. In the book, they put it at the end, but I like to talk about it kind of at the beginning, which is about, okay. No, I want to talk about some of this. That's not the picture I thought it was. Which has to do with enzymes. Now, this is the digestive system. We're interested in digesting things. And so I want to talk about what digestion is. And this is going to be kind of broad for the whole thing. There's two aspects of digestion as a function. There's mechanical digestion and chemical digestion. Mechanical digestion is breaking the physical structure of food down. The most obvious example of that would be chewing. But all through your digestive tract, something's happening to break the food down into smaller and smaller bits. And then chemical digestion is going in and actually breaking the chemical bonds between molecules to get to the nutrient molecules we actually want out of our food. Now, when I talk about nutrient molecules, I'm basically talking about 3 of the 4 types of macromolecules. We have carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Eventually, the carbohydrates are going to be broken down into simple sugars, what we call monosaccharides. Lipids are going to be broken down into fatty acids, if that's possible. Your average fat molecule is 3 fatty acids attached to a central core. Other lipids like cholesterol or certain vitamins and that sort of thing, they're absorbed as they are. But when we break down lipids, we're usually breaking complex fats, triglycerides, down into simple fatty acids. And then proteins are broken down into individual amino acids. So when we talk about nutrient molecules, we're really talking about those. Monosaccharides, fatty acids, and amino acids are the main ones. Okay. And really, as the book makes a good point of talking about, I think, nutrients we can put into 2 different classes. There's macronutrients, which is what I was just talking about, and micronutrients, which would be vitamins and minerals and that sort of thing, small molecules that don't fit into the macromolecule scheme. But I'm going to concentrate more on the macronutrients. Now, what I want to talk about a little bit is the idea of chemical digestion, the enzymes that do that. This table here lays out a number of different enzymes by name, where they're produced, what they break down, and what their breakdown product is. And I want to talk about some of these. A common way to think about chemical digestion, and I think this is still quite relevant, although the book muddies the waters. We start breaking down carbohydrates in the mouth with the saliva. And then the stomach is where we start breaking down proteins. And then the small intestines break everything down. So that's really the first place where we break down lipids. So the second item in this table, which I'm not going to zoom in on, is salivary amylase. Amylase is an enzyme that breaks down complex carbohydrates. The word, the root amyl really means starch. So this is an enzyme that breaks down starches. And starches are really just chains of glucose molecules. Plants make glucose and other simple sugars and use them all the time for things that we don't use in our body necessarily. They're structural, they save them as energy-rich molecules in the form of starch and that kind of thing. So like a potato is very starchy because it's saving all that glucose for when the plant starts to grow from that tuber root structure. We don't exactly need starch in our body like that, so we break it down with amylase to get at the individual glucose molecules there. And we do that in our mouth to begin with. Glucose is the primary fuel for our nervous system. In fact, it's the exclusive fuel. Other organs can get fuel from lipids and proteins, namely fatty acids and amino acids. But in the brain or central nervous system, you don't want to do that. What do lipids do in the nervous system? What's their very important role that we don't want to touch? What do lipids do? Yeah, they're myelin. If you start breaking down myelin, you stop insulating axons, and axons can't send signals efficiently. So you don't want to touch the lipids. What do proteins do in the nervous system? That one's the easy question because it's just myelin. Proteins do a lot of things. What are some ideas or some examples of what proteins do in the nervous system? If you think of a nervous system protein. This very awkward silence is being recorded for posterity's sake. Feel free to fill it. Anybody think of any protein that's in the nervous system? What's the basic function of nervous tissue? Where we sort of start talking about nervous tissue. So neurons are the main cells. What's the basic function of neurons that we talk about at the beginning of the nervous tissue system?
Is it communication?
Right, it's about communication. How do they communicate? Electrical signals. So, how do they generate those action potentials? What's at the root of the action potential working? So, acetylcholine is not a great answer, but it's a good one to start with. Okay? So, if we're talking about muscle action potential, which is a good model for the nervous system, acetylcholine binds to its receptor on the cell membrane, the muscle cell membrane, and causes muscle action potential. Acetylcholine is not a very prevalent neurotransmitter in the nervous system itself, but it is one. So there are situations where acetylcholine binds to its receptor and starts electrical activity in the neuron. More often, it's going to be something like glutamate or GABA or something like that. Regardless of what the neurotransmitter is, what does it bind to? Which I actually just said.
Receptors.
Binds to receptors. What are receptors made of? Proteins. You break down proteins, you remove receptors from neurons, neurons will stop getting information. Another place I was hoping someone would go was the action potential is about sodium rushing in through sodium channels, potassium rushing out through potassium channels. What are those channels made of? Proteins. You start breaking down those channels, then you stop being able to manipulate ion movements and get signals, action potentials moving along. Okay? So in the brain, you don't want to touch lipids because that's for insulating axons. You don't want to touch proteins because they're very important about how neurons communicate. So it's just about carbohydrates, just about glucose. So when we eat food, we want to eat food that's high in glucose content or high in carbohydrate content. And so we start breaking down those carbohydrates right away in our saliva. You might have noticed that when you taste something sweet, you just want more of it. Okay? You open up that bag of Oreos and you're not going to stop, okay? Till they're all good. We are hardwired to some degree to do that. Now, I'm not giving you an excuse to binge on Oreos, but it is kind of the way that the human digestive system works. When there's a glucose-rich source of food, we want to take in as much as we can. Now, these days, in modern times, getting glucose-rich foods is very easy, or carbohydrate-rich foods is very easy. But in most of the human condition, history, whatever you want to call it, those types of food were hard to come by. And so when one was found, we behaviorally decided to get as much as possible to get carbohydrates into our system. But nowadays, that just leads to poor eating choices and that kind of thing. But it's part of what makes us responsive to carbohydrates immediately is that we start breaking them down first thing in our mouth. Now, having set that up, let me just tell you something that I don't like about what the book says. And it's not just this book. Every book does this. It's become kind of common in textbooks. And I think they've all sort of gotten the idea from the wrong place together. The first thing in this table here says lingual lipase. What do you think a lipase breaks down? Lipids, right? That's exactly how you parse what that means. Amylase breaks down starch because amyl means starch. Lipases break down lipids because lip is the root of lipid. Okay. I don't believe that lingual lipase is really a thing. Okay. Now, actually, it is a thing. I just don't believe it's a really big part of the human condition. As I've been trying to find information about lingual lipases, I've seen it working in A&P books over the past decade or so. What I've seen in the research is that lingual lipase is usually described based on rat models. So if you look at the digestive system of rats, you'll see lingual lipase. They secrete this enzyme in their saliva so they can break down lipids. Now, rats and humans can be very useful comparisons to make in a lot of cases, but I think this is a really bad case of that. The basis of making this kind of comparison probably comes from the fact that rats and humans are both omnivores. We're not just herbivores, we're not just carnivores, we can eat anything. And so we must have similar digestive function because we can digest everything. But the problem is, while we're both omnivores, we're different types of omnivores. Humans are hunter-gatherers. We seek out the kind of food that we want. Rats are scavengers. They eat whatever they can get their hands on. And to some degree, humans do eat whatever they can get their hands on too. But we have some behavioral features to how we get that food, whereas rats just eat whatever's out there. Being a scavenger, they just are in, it's just important to get calories into their system. And lipids are the most caloric nutrient molecule, macronutrient. Almost twice as good as carbohydrates. However, rat brains are not as sophisticated as human brains. So it's okay if they're a little bit less discerning about what they get for food, because if they don't power their brains quite as well as humans can, they're not going to suddenly not be able to solve calculus or something like that. Rats don't need to do that. So they don't need the same kind of high glucose type of diet that we do. And so they're just looking for the best caloric content that they can. And I think that's the case. Now, another reason why I don't think that it's important for humans is because to be able to break down lipids, you have to fight against the fact that lipids are hydrophobic. If you mix lipids into a water solution, they will tend to clump up together, or they'll tend to separate from the water component. And so lipase doesn't do a whole lot of good until something breaks the lipids apart. The process of breaking lipids apart is called emulsification. You have had dealings with emulsifying agents before. Now, the simplest example of emulsification, which doesn't involve an emulsifying agent, is just if you've ever had Italian dressing on a salad. Okay. Oil and vinegar-based dressings separate into an oil and a vinegar or water phase. And when you want to put it on the salad, you shake it up. Okay. That mixes it. That's emulsification. How long does that last? Long enough to pour it on your salad, but as soon as you put it back on the table, it'll separate back out. Okay. If you want salad dressing to stay emulsified, you have to add an emulsifying agent. Now, the most common emulsifying agent, which is really at the root of most salad dressings, has to do with mayonnaise. Does anybody know what mayonnaise is made of? You can go home today and make mayonnaise. Eggs and oil. Okay. Go home, take an egg, take some oil, mix them together, and that's mayonnaise. It's rather disgusting mayonnaise. To make mayonnaise good, you have to add stuff to it, whether it's just salt or, garlic and other stuff to make some sort of fancy aioli. But there's a thing in eggs that is a natural emulsifying agent called lecithin, by the way. And so any non-oil vinegar separating kind of salad dressing is going to be made with eggs in some way to emulsify it. Same thing with making, cake batter or something like that. You always have to put an egg in there to help emulsify things. To get the batter to be homogeneous so that you can bake the cake. We don't have emulsifying agents in our saliva that's going to help a lingual lipase do its job. I don't know if rats do either, but I just don't think it's a big deal for humans. Now, having said all that about lingual lipase, right after salivary amylase, the next thing listed is gastric lipase. That's a thing. Okay. Gastric lipase is an enzyme that's made in the stomach, hence gastric. It's just not active in the stomach. It's released in the stomach and it moves into the small intestine with the food from your stomach. So as soon as the lipids are emulsified in the small intestine, the lipase is there ready to do its job. Okay. And then it goes on to the next one's pepsin, which is a stomach enzyme for what do we call that? Protein. And then it goes into a number of different enzymes that have to do with small intestine function. The other thing I wanted to do, talking about enzymes, is to talk about a class of enzymes that break carbohydrates down into their final saccharides. We certainly don't have time to do that now. So next week I'm going to start with that, and then we'll go into the other functions of the digestive system. Because there's a little story about those enzymes to tell. So have a nice week. I am going to try to